As the final credits began to roll in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, it not only felt like it was the ending to a masterpiece, but it also felt like the end of my time with Link on Nintendo 64. It had been a journey of highs and lows, of forging long-lasting memories and escapism into a world which felt so alive, so meaningful, and an experience which defined a very specific moment of my life. I mentioned in my review of that game a few years ago now that in many ways the Ocarina of Time is a coming-of-age experience, and within the game now ending too, it also felt like it was putting an end to a chapter, not only in the game but also in real life for me personally. The fairy boy who turned into a man, but in doing so left behind a life he had known in Kokiri Forest. At the end of the game, he was effectively trapped in the adult world, having experienced lost friendships and having witnessed the passing of time which he was seemingly unable to control. I never expected to return to the comfort of Hyrule on Nintendo 64 with Link again. Whilst the N64 DD was cancelled, and so too was any hope of Ura Zelda's expansion pack, which had left a glimmer of hope. Given how many months and years of delays we experienced waiting for Ocarina of Time, it just felt impossible that Nintendo would be able to develop another Zelda experience on the Nintendo 64 in the window of time that was left before we just knew Nintendo would be moving on to their next console. And yet it did happen. Not only was it not a mere expansion of Ocarina of Time, it was a fully realised brand new concept, a game which was darker in tone, had unusual mechanics, and had a stronger emphasis on interaction with characters in the game. And so for today's video we're taking a look back at The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, the Zelda game which never should have existed. It seemed too that Miyamoto felt that producing a new Zelda game would be impossible on Nintendo 64, and quite frankly he's gone on record to say that he didn't even want to. His original idea was to create a harder version of Ocarina of Time with tougher dungeons, tweaked combat and some new additional puzzles, almost using the second quest in the original Zelda as a baseline for what to do with Ocarina of Time. Aonuma, the game's dungeon designer, hated this idea. After having spent the last few years of his life crafting the dungeons of OOT, the thought of reworking the same dungeons over again was of no interest to him. And yet, being the dutiful employee he was, he respectfully agreed to Miyamoto's plans and began work. Aonuma found this demoralising and began altering a dungeon he was working on so much that it hardly even resembled the original source material. He created dungeons which were way beyond remixes of OOTs, and when perhaps realising the potential of what he'd done, he finally asked Miyamoto for permission to create an entirely new Zelda game. Miyamoto knew that timescales would be tight, so to get a Zelda game out on Nintendo 64 just before the next console would be available would be a tough order. But sure, Miyamoto responded, but you'll only have 1 year to have a game completely finished. Along with that, Aonuma had unknowingly put himself in the role as the game's director. Miyamoto didn't want to direct the game as he was far too busy on other projects, which is why the second quest for Ocarina of Time plan had worked so well for him. At the same time, however, Miyamoto knew that the director for this new Zelda project would need to be a team member who knew Ocarina of Time inside out. Aonuma at this stage began to have doubts, and the weight of the project and also gamers' expectations quickly dawned on him. How could he follow up a game which had been hailed as the best game of all time, had sold over 7 million copies, and do that with a smaller team and just 12 months to go from start to finish? Needing professional support, he reached out to Koizumi, who was also a director on Ocarina of Time. Koizumi had been working independently on a brand new board game internally at Nintendo, which was based around cops and robbers, where you'd play in a compact game space in a world where you'd basically be replaying the events over and over again. Now realising that Koizumi was busy with his own project, he still pitched the idea of the new Zelda project to him anyway, perhaps hoping to get a second opinion or some further ideas on what he could do with a new game in a limited amount of time. Surprisingly though, Koizumi said that he would join the new Zelda game project, but under one strict condition, that he would only join if he was allowed to do whatever he wanted to do. Unsurprisingly, Koizumi had realised his cops and robbers concept could easily be translated into the new Zelda game. Instead of having to create a brand new IP for Nintendo using his own idea, he could now easily get one of the company's most important IPs to use with this idea. The core concept for his Cops and Robbers game had been simple. He wanted to make a game where you had to catch the criminal in 1 week, but in reality you could finish the game in 1 hour. Aonuma loved this idea. He thought that the process so that they might be able to create a game with depth rather than breadth, which would heavily help their timescale. He also felt that if you played the same places and enjoyed the same events over and over again, it would be constantly expanded until the game's climax. This sounded like an extraordinarily unique idea, but Koizumi admits that he wasn't technically his own idea. The movie Run Lola Run had been released, and aside from a very unique and very European movie, it had an interesting twist. In the movie, Lola had to run around Berlin to get 100,000 Deutschmarks in cash in 20 minutes to save her boyfriend. She gets killed in the process, but in her death she unexpectedly gets another shot at completing the task. This time though, she was armed with a new 20-minute time limit and the knowledge that she had from her past attempts. This however is contradicted by Miyamoto himself, who stated in an interview that he basically saw the trailer for Run Lola Run and thought it was crazy how similar the plot of the movie was to the Zelda game that they were working on. Miyamoto however liked the replaying mechanic, and given there was already a basic time mechanic built into Ocarina of Time with its day-night cycle, the project seemed to have found its voice. Originally the game planned to have a 7-day time cycle instead of the game's final 3-day cycle. It was for multiple reasons, including time constraints, but more importantly, the producers felt it was too difficult for gamers to remember 7 days worth of events with so many characters doing different things on different days. So the decision was made to cut the time mechanic down from 7 days to just 3. Koizumi however was still working on another new game concept that he was heavily engrossed in, leaving Aonuma to manage the new Zelda game himself. Miyamoto, perhaps realising that this new Zelda game was actually onto something quite special, kept pulling him back onto the game's development, and eventually Koizuma's new game project was officially cancelled. Koizumi said he was in shock, but he had also heard rumours it was going to happen to ensure that he would only be working on Zelda full time. Both Aonuma and Koizumi were sceptical that Miyamoto would leave them to create the game that they wanted. A known perfectionist and hard worker, Miyamoto was not only known for his great mind when it came to game creation, but his drive to push the games as far as possible. But his role at Nintendo was changing at this time. Gone were the days when Miyamoto would just be working flat out on one AAA project at a time. He was now transitioning into more of a conductor type role, overseeing many game projects rather than just one at a time. In the year of Majora's Mask's release, he was credited as a supervisor or producer of 5 Nintendo 64 games, and not forgetting he was also working on the next generation console. The team wanted to expand some of Ocarina of Time's mechanics which had not been fully realised in that game, such as that of the mask to help it feel more expanded, and they also wanted to flesh out many of the characters in the game with more personality, storylines, and by doing so attach more emotion into the world as a whole, especially in its key characters. Speaking of key characters, the game wanted to have its own voice and be free of some of the tropes which the series was known for. Ganon wouldn't play a part in the game, and even Princess Zelda would only briefly appear in a dreamlike sequence. And speaking of dreams, the idea for the moon came to Aonuma when he was daydreaming, pondering what would happen if the moon was to fall to Earth. With 6 directors in place for the game, you may have been expecting that they would each work very closely with one another, but the truth was far from that. Once the concept and mechanics of the game had been worked out, each director took charge of an area of the game and they worked with smaller teams of around 10 staff members each to complete their designated area of the game. The staff credits on the game are incredibly small for a Zelda game, and this was perhaps made possible by the fact that they'd all worked on Ocarina of Time and so were really comfortable with their past experience of working with the game's engine and working on that specific title. When the game was announced with the working title of Zelda Gaiden, the press immediately expected, like the name suggested, it would be a side story to that of Ocarina of Time, and it would be the Ura Zelda which had long been rumoured. But in August of 1999 at Nintendo Space World, the game would be shown and its new title, Zelda Mask of Majora for Japan, was confirmed in November 99, as well as the Western name of Majora's Mask. So brings us to April in the year 2000 with the Japanese release of Majora's Mask. The Western releases were 6 months after the Japanese release, which was the longest period in the franchise's history. The game went on to receive critical acclaim and yet sold less than the previous 4 Zelda games, perhaps not helped by it being a later N64 release. But let's all meet up in the year 2000 because I vividly remember the game on the 1st of December, which is the day that I purchased it because it was my birthday. And although the game had come out a couple of weeks before that, I'd been busy working 12-hour shifts and hadn't managed to get the time to buy the game. And, well, there was no rush for me because I just knew I wouldn't have the time to actually sit down and play it. It was a Friday and I was off that day because it was my birthday, and I also remember that I was off for that weekend as well. And sure, it was dark and cold outside, but I knew that I had 3 days to jump back into Hyrule and play through the game. Or at least that's what I thought. You see, unlike Ocarina of Time, I hadn't been following the build up to the game in that much detail. I had left home and I was fending for myself pretty much, so spending a few pounds on a gaming magazine was now a luxury rather than something that I would pester my mum to pick up with the weekly food shop. I was living the bachelor life, and so I was no longer spending hours gazing over the pages of magazines like I used to. Well, actually I was, but it was a different kind of magazine. And most of the free time I had was spent either down the pub or nursing a hangover from the previous visit to the pub. And yes, I just turned 16, but I always looked older and I was over 6 foot tall, so I never got ID'd or anything like that. It was a time in my life when I wasn't getting the same excitement or joy that I used to get out of games. Perhaps it was fatigue of the Nintendo 64 as a console, or perhaps it was just part of getting older and having to work a full-time job, pay bills, do my own cooking and all of that adulting type stuff. It was that awkward transitional period where on the one hand you want to cling to things that you loved from the past, almost like a comfort blanket, but at the same time you're an adult and quickly realise all those years you couldn't wait to be an adult were not really worth it. In my mind I was thinking that I'd be taking a weekend to return to Link, catch up on Hyrule, revisit some familiar faces and perhaps get a feel-good kick from the game, and basically having one last romp with Zelda on Nintendo 64 for the last time. So imagine my surprise when I started playing the game. In the land of Hyrule there echoes a legend held dearly by the royal family that tells of a boy who after battling evil and saving Hyrule, crept away from the land that had made him a legend. Done with the battles he once waged across time, he embarked on a journey, a secret and personal journey. A journey in search of a beloved and invaluable friend. A friend with whom he parted ways when he finally fulfilled his heroic destiny and took his place among the legends. Immediately the game drops you back into the Zelda timeline when, after defeating Ganon at the end of Ocarina of Time, the young Link timeline continues. But instead of rejoining Link at a happy time, like I was personally expecting, you catch up with Link at a time when he's clearly quite lonely. Navi left Link at the end of OOT, and I just kind of always imagined that Link would have returned to Kokiri Forest and been welcomed as a hero. But Link still feels like an outsider, longing for the lost companionship he found with Navi, and that perhaps doesn't belong in this world in which he now finds himself. Perhaps it was another example of art mimicking life which drew me immediately into the game. But the somewhat depressing tone of the game starting, it wasn't missed on me. This clearly wasn't going to be the happy and upbeat start to the game which Ocarina of Time had. This was going to be something quite different. This is further emphasised when the game's opening cutscene, and spoilers ahead here for anyone wanting to skip, but when Skull Kid appears and steals Epona, Link was further separated from what felt like the last attachment he had to his own past. Link was now completely alone. But it was when after giving chase that Skull Kid announced that he'd got rid of Epona that you realised just how much darker the game's tone would be. Distancing Link from one of the previous game's most iconic relationships with Navi was one thing, but mere minutes into this experience also implying the killing off of one of the most important relationships from OOT was another. It immediately let you know as the player the game wasn't afraid to play with your emotions, to strip you back to nothingness and to make you feel whatever you'd done in Ocarina of Time before this was basically now meaningless. This was a new world in which you were at the mercy of. Further degrading Link by turning him into a Deku Scrub, perhaps the weakest being in the game, further humiliates the character of Link. We left Ocarina of Time thinking of Link as a hero, but less than 30 minutes into this game, Link had definitely become a zero. The first character Link meets in this state is the happy mask salesman. We all know and loved him from Ocarina of Time, but even here he seems much more fleshed out. He's able to help Link and transform him back into his original state, but he wants Link's help in return. He expects Link to retrieve Majora's mask from Skull Kid. Exiting the caves, you realise you're not in Hyrule anymore, instead Termina. With its clock town focal point, it feels completely alien. The moon in the sky has assumed a horrible guise, and a looming catastrophe hangs over the town, whilst at the same time they're preparing for their annual festival. As you meet the townspeople, you realise, much in the same way as real life, people are reacting in very different ways and have different emotions around what is happening. This more three-dimensional range to the NPCs is so welcomed. It fleshes out the world much more so than Ocarina of Time did. Everyone you speak to seems to have a purpose, their own worries, fears, needs and wants, and at the same time you have your own quest to contend with, which constantly interlinks and intertwines with the people that you interact with. The series was always known for its side quests, but here the side quests almost become main quests, as they intertwined with that of your main objectives so much. You must travel to the outlying regions of Termina and rescue who are only referred to as the Four who are there. Who are the Four? Why are they there? What will they do for you? The game remains ambiguous around this, I believe to intentionally further add to the mysterious feeling that the game constantly pushed onto you as the player. With only 4 main dungeons as opposed to the many found in Ocarina of Time, this fits in not only to the limited development time, but also the need for you to visit smaller areas in repetition-like manner. Ocarina of Time left you pretty much to play the game at your own pace and rarely had a forced sense of urgency. Majora's Mask, however, constantly makes you aware of the impending doom that you're in by pressing the need to do things quickly. At times it almost makes you feel like you're playing a forced speedrun of the game. You need to solve puzzles quickly or face the very real threat of having to start large chunks of the game over again. This trial and error method keeps you on your toes, whereas if you died in Ocarina of Time you'd see the game over screen. Majora's Mask shows you the cataclysmic impact of your failure firsthand. At various times in the game you'll encounter events which just feel so deep and impactful that it went somewhere a Zelda game had never gone before. Take for instance the Ghost of Damani, using the Song of Healing to heal his soul and finally allowing him to transition from the mortal realm, shows the game giving closure to characters who've been trapped in a state of spiritual limbo. This too is another one of the game's core themes, that of life, death and spirituality. It's not only the mental transformation of Link as a character you experience, you also experience the physical transformation of him too with the help of the 24 masks in the game. Whilst many of the masks serve a singular purpose, there are some which are essential to complete the game and allow a metamorphosis of the playable character. My personal favourite allows Link to transform into a Zora, complete with the aquatic abilities you'd expect from this long adored race. Or how about a Goron, complete with strength and slower movement to illustrate their heavier physiques. Whereas in Ocarina of Time it felt more subtle differences between the young Link as a child and the adult Link, Majora's Mask finally lets you play as many of the races which for so long we'd only been able to interact with on a verbal level. Using the Bomber's Notebook you must plan who to help at a time when they need the help. The characters in the game have a schedule of when they need help and where they may be, and you'll be able to find them, and this results in you having to plan what to accomplish in any given 3-day cycle. If you try to get too much done you can find yourself running out of time and having to reset back 3 days, but the clock at the bottom of the screen is a constant reminder, as too are the on-screen prompts counting down the hours until your impending doom. Completing these tasks usually results in masks being offered up as rewards and thus provide you with further items to work out how they can assist you in completing the game and the mission at hand. With compelling dungeons, side quests which serve as a genuine purpose aside from filler content, and a storyline which tackles such strong and emotive themes, the game's adventure takes you to places only ever seen in this alternative universe, and one which many games are still yearning for Nintendo to return to. It is graphically though the game where it naturally shares a lot of assets with Ocarina of Time. This was due to the short development cycle and also the games sharing the same engine. This was a major contributor to the game being able to meet its very tight deadline, but to say the game is a rehash is not entirely correct. Majora's Mask requires the expansion pack to play the game, and this further refined the game's engine by having some higher quality textures and allowing for locations to feature more characters and enemies, which moves the game far away from the somewhat barren Hyrule field. The fog too is near non-existent, and although it is never bad in Ocarina of Time, it gives Majora's Mask a much more polished look to its aesthetics. Enemies and characters too appear to have much more definition, more clarity, which is important to bring them further to life. They seem more expressive, which is also combined with the now more lifelike personalities they possess. There are select textures in the game which are actually lower quality than in the previous game, and at times the frame rate can drop lower, but how much this impacts you as a player will really depend on your expectations. For me, the world the game is set in is so engrossing that small annoyances such as that are not really an issue for me personally, but I often wonder what somebody playing the game for the first time may think of it. In a world of 4K 120 FPS games, it will no doubt look and perhaps feel like a relic. I would normally suggest the 3DS version, which is the latest version of the game officially to be released, but that game has its own issues which are outside the context of this video, but who knows, maybe one day I will cover it. The fact that neither Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask have had a proper remaster or remake in a sense of bringing them games into the modern standards is really a strange decision, and yet it may also be about timing. When this does happen, and I really do think it will, the two games would sell like hotcakes. And even watching YouTube videos of fan creations of the game in the Unreal Engine shows just how impressive the game will eventually look. For the time being, purists will stick to the original hardware, but I think just last month a fantastic new HD texture pack made by fans is available for anyone wanting to play the game on an emulator. And seeing how disastrous the launch of the NSO expansion pack service was, I have little hope that when Majora's Mask is added to the service shortly, that it won't have the same issues that Ocarina of Time had. It is, however, the game's audio department which really stands out. I'm sure there's not anyone who played Ocarina of Time back in the day who hasn't got as many songs etched into their memories even to this day, but Majora's Mask is different. You regain the Ocarina at the start of the game, and there is comfort in knowing many of these songs that Ocarina of Time had do make a reappearance here, perhaps with different outcomes when playing to help things, basically to help them feel fresh. And it does play an important part in the game, much in the same way as its predecessor, but as a whole the soundtrack is much more sinister and dark in its tone. Koji Kondo seems to have also had free rein here to create something unlike anything that we've heard from him before. At times it feels like it could be more at home in a Castlevania game, with its gothic horror compositions drawing a sense of despair. There are at times it becomes ambient and mixes familiar themes, but with synth-like instruments, and instruments not heard like pipes before. It creates something really unsettling. At times though, I was left longing for something a bit more upbeat and happy in its tones. One of my favourite albums of all time is the Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, but yet that title is exactly how I would describe the soundtrack of Majora's Mask as a whole. It's another example of how the game instills a sense of unease on the player, and whilst I think that overall Ocarina of Time is the better soundtrack, Majora's Mask is instead like an expensive whiskey that you only want to delve into on special occasions. It's unique, different, and also stands alone as, well, the most impressionable pieces of Koji Kondo's career works. The game's controls are not really worth mentioning, to be honest. Anybody who picked up Ocarina of Time will feel instantly at home here. Aside from a few new animations like flips, there is little here which you haven't seen before. Certain times you will morph in and gain new skills when you change into different characters to portray, but for me Ocarina of Time was spot on, and so in my opinion if it's not broke then don't fix it, and that's exactly what I think they did here. As my time drew to a close in Majora's Mask after roughly 25 hours the first time I completed it, and that wasn't going for a 100% run, I knew that this would certainly be the end for Zelda on Nintendo 64. Majora's Mask is a game which perhaps should never have been. With its back up against the wall and with a tight time frame, Nintendo did the impossible, and instead of releasing an expanded version of the predecessor, it instead gave gamers something truly unique. In the same way that Spielberg said that Temple of Doom was dark in tone due to how he was feeling at that time and the problems that he was having in his personal life, Majora's Mask feels at times like a glimpse into the mindset of Aonuma. Miyamoto may get the limelight and critical praise as the main man at Nintendo, but Majora's Mask showed that behind the scenes there are staff at Nintendo who aren't all magic mushrooms and power stars. In a way, it's disappointing that the game was so late in the console's lifespan, and also even perhaps further limited its sales with the requirement of the expansion pack. Gamers pretty much universally love Majora's Mask, and yet it's hard to think of Nintendo ever going back to create a main Zelda game that's as dark as this one. It's another coming of age style story, and yet it's much more than that. It's a story of lost friendship, real world problems, of life, of death, and of love. It's a story of redemption and finding inner peace in the chaos that the real world is. Simply put, Majora's Mask is escapism for the gamer into a world that they wouldn't want to exist, but happen to be stuck in. So how do you remember Majora's Mask? Did you pick it up back in the day, and did you pick it up on the first day it was available? And what are your memories or expectations going into it? Did you play it years later after the game garnered a cult following, which seems to have never stopped growing? Would you like to see Nintendo return to the darker tones that the game portrayed for another Zelda experience, or do you think that this should be left as an example of a time when Nintendo did something quite unlike Nintendo and the result was something quite beautiful? As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comment section down below, and until next time.